Have you ever found yourself saying yes when you really wanted to say no? Maybe it was to a friend asking for a favor you didn't have time for, or a coworker pushing their responsibilities onto you. That sinking feeling in your chest, the frustration bubbling up, but instead of speaking up, you stayed silent, afraid of disappointing someone or being seen as selfish. Sound familiar? Here's the thing: setting boundaries isn't about being harsh or unkind. It's about honoring your own needs and values, and that's where Stoicism comes in. Epictetus, one of the great Stoic philosophers, once said, "Some things are within our control and some things are not." This simple yet profound idea is the foundation of setting boundaries without guilt. When we focus on what's truly within our control, our choices, our actions, our values, we stop trying to manage other people's expectations or emotions. Instead, we align ourselves with virtue and reason, making decisions that reflect who we are and what we stand for. In this video, we'll explore how Stoicism teaches us to set boundaries with clarity and confidence, freeing ourselves from the weight of guilt. You'll discover practical tools to navigate difficult conversations, stay true to your principles, and cultivate a sense of inner peace even when others might not understand or agree. This isn't about shutting people out. It's about stepping into your power and living a life that's authentically yours. So, let's dive in and uncover how Stoic wisdom can transform the way you approach boundaries starting today. What if boundaries weren't selfish but necessary for living virtuously? Think about that for a moment. So often, we associate setting boundaries with being rigid, unkind, or even self-centered. But what if instead they were acts of self-respect and alignment with nature? This is exactly how Stoicism frames the concept of boundaries. For the Stoics, boundaries aren't walls to keep people out. They're guideposts to help us live in harmony with our values and the world around us. Seneca, one of Stoicism's most influential voices, put it this way: "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." In other words, true wealth comes from knowing what's enough for you, what aligns with your principles, and having the courage to say no to what doesn't. When we set boundaries, we're not rejecting others, we're affirming ourselves. We're choosing to live authentically rather than bending to external expectations or pressures. But here's the challenge: setting boundaries often feels uncomfortable because we fear judgment. We worry about how others will react. Will they think we're selfish? Will they be upset? The Stoics remind us that other people's opinions are outside our control. What is within our control is how we respond to those opinions and whether we stay true to our own values. So ask yourself, what boundaries have you avoided setting out of fear of judgment? Maybe it's saying no to extra work when you're already overwhelmed, or stepping back from a relationship that drains your energy. Whatever it is, recognizing these moments is the first step toward reclaiming your power. Stoicism teaches us that boundaries are not just about protecting our time or energy, they're about living in alignment with nature. And nature, for the Stoics, means living in accordance with reason and virtue. When we set boundaries, we're not just saying no to others, we're saying yes to ourselves, to our growth, our peace, and our ability to contribute meaningfully to the world. It's not selfish, it's essential, and it's a practice that, over time, can transform not just how we interact with others, but how we see ourselves. So, how do we start setting boundaries without feeling guilty? The answer lies in one of Stoicism's most powerful tools, the dichotomy of control. At its core, Stoicism teaches us to focus only on what we can control and let go of what we can't. Sounds simple, right? But here's the catch. Most of us spend way too much energy worrying about things outside our control, like how others will react when we say no. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, put it perfectly: You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. What he's saying is this: your boundaries are within your control. You decide what you're willing to accept, what aligns with your values, and where you draw the line. But here's the thing: other people's reactions, those are outside your control. They might get upset, they might judge you, but that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to act with integrity and stay true to yourself. Let's bring this into a modern context. Imagine you're at work and your boss keeps piling on tasks even though you're already stretched thin. You want to say no, but you're afraid of being seen as uncooperative or lazy. Here's where the dichotomy of control comes in. You can't control how your boss will react, but you can control how you communicate your limits. You can say, "I'm happy to help, but I need to prioritize my current workload to maintain quality." That's setting a boundary, clear, respectful, and rooted in your values. Now think about your own life. How often do you let others' opinions dictate your limits? Do you say yes when you really want to say no, just to avoid conflict or judgment? The Stoics would tell you this: every time you let fear of disapproval guide your decisions, you're giving away your power. But when you focus on what's within your control, your choices, your actions, your boundaries, you reclaim that power. This isn't about being rigid or unyielding. It's about understanding where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. It's about recognizing that you can't control how others feel, but you can control how you show up in the world. And when you start living by that principle, something incredible happens. The guilt begins to fade, because you're no longer trying to manage everyone else's expectations. You're simply being true to yourself. So the next time you feel that familiar tug of guilt when setting a boundary, remember the dichotomy of control. Ask yourself, is this within my control? If it is, act with clarity and confidence. If it's not, let it go, because in the end, boundaries aren't about pleasing others, they're about honoring yourself. And that's a practice worth embracing. Boundaries are not walls, they are bridges to living virtuously. Think about that for a moment. When we set boundaries, we're not shutting people out, we're creating space to live in alignment with our highest values. And for the Stoics, those values are rooted in the four cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. These virtues aren't just abstract ideas, they're practical tools that can guide us in setting boundaries with clarity and purpose. Let's start with courage. Courage is what allows us to say no when we need to, even when it feels uncomfortable. It's the strength to stand firm in our values, even when others might push back. Think about it. How often have you avoided setting a boundary because you were afraid of conflict or judgment? Courage reminds us that discomfort is temporary, but living out of alignment with our values has a much deeper cost. As Epictetus once said, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. In other words, know your values and then have the courage to act on them, even when it's hard. Next, there's justice. Justice isn't just about fairness to others, it's also about fairness to ourselves. When we set boundaries, we're not being selfish, we're ensuring that our time, energy, and resources are distributed in a way that aligns with our principles. Imagine you're constantly saying yes to others at the expense of your own well-being. Is that fair to you? Is it fair to the people who rely on you when you're running on empty? Justice reminds us that boundaries are about balance, about giving to others without neglecting ourselves. Then there's wisdom. Wisdom helps us discern when and how to set boundaries. It's about understanding what's truly important and what's worth our energy. Wisdom asks us to reflect, is this request in line with my values? Is this relationship healthy for me? Is this commitment something I can realistically take on? Without wisdom, we risk setting boundaries that are too rigid or too loose. But with wisdom, we can navigate these decisions with clarity and insight. Finally, there's temperance. Temperance is about moderation and self-control. It's about knowing when to say enough is enough. Think about it. How often do we overcommit because we're afraid of missing out or letting others down? Temperance reminds us that it's okay to set limits, to say, this is what I can handle and this is where I need to draw the line. It's not about being harsh or unkind. It's about being honest with ourselves and others. So here's a question to reflect on. Which of these virtues do you need to embrace to set healthier boundaries? Is it courage to say no when you need to, justice to ensure fairness to yourself and others, wisdom to discern what's truly important, or temperance to know when enough is enough? Each of these virtues offers a unique lens through which we can approach boundary setting, helping us live more authentically and harmoniously. Epictetus said, "If you wish to be a writer, write." In the same way, if you wish to live virtuously, act virtuously. Boundaries are not obstacles, they're opportunities to practice these virtues in real, tangible ways. They are bridges that connect us to a life of integrity, balance, and peace. So, as you think about the boundaries you need to set, let these virtues be your compass. They'll guide you not just in what you do, but in who you become. Why do we feel guilty when others disapprove of our boundaries? It's a question that hits close to home for so many of us. We set a boundary, maybe we say no to a social event because we're exhausted, or we decline a request at work because we're already overwhelmed, and then comes that nagging guilt. We wonder, did I hurt their feelings? Will they think less of me? But here's the thing, that guilt often has less to do with the boundary itself and more to do with our fear of judgment. And that's where Stoicism offers a powerful shift in perspective. The Stoics believed that other people's opinions are indifferent, meaning they have no bearing on our moral character or inner worth. Seneca, one of Stoicism's most eloquent voices, put it bluntly, "What does it matter what others think of you? What matters is what you think of yourself." In other words, seeking approval from others is a futile pursuit because their opinions are outside our control. What is within our control is how we respond to those opinions and whether we let them dictate our actions. Let's bring this into a real-life scenario. Imagine you've been invited to a party, but you're feeling drained and know you need a quiet evening to recharge. You politely decline, but instead of leaving it at that, you find yourself over-explaining. "I'm so sorry, I'd love to come, but I've just been so busy and I'm really tired and I promise I'll make it next time." Sound familiar? Why do we do this? Because we're afraid of being judged as rude or uninterested. But here's the Stoic truth, you don't owe anyone an explanation for honoring your own need. A simple, "Thank you for the invitation, but I can't make it," is enough. Now think about this, what would change if you stopped fearing others' opinions? What if, instead of worrying about how your boundaries might be perceived, you focused on how they align with your values and well-being? The Stoics would tell you that this shift in mindset is liberating. When you stop seeking approval, you free yourself from the weight of guilt and the endless cycle of people-pleasing. You start living for yourself, not for the expectations of others. This doesn't mean you become indifferent to the people in your life. It simply means you stop letting their opinions control you. You can still care deeply about others while holding firm to your boundaries. In fact, setting clear boundaries often leads to healthier, more authentic relationships because they're built on honesty and mutual respect, not fear or obligation. So the next time you feel that pang of guilt after setting a boundary, pause and ask yourself, is this guilt coming from within, or is it rooted in my fear of what others might think? Remember, their opinions are indifferent to your moral character. What matters is how you choose to live with integrity, clarity, and self-respect. And when you embrace that truth, you'll find that the guilt starts to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence in your ability to honor yourself. Setting boundaries is an act of self-love, not selfishness. Let that sink in for a moment. How often do we confuse the two, self-love and selfishness? We're taught to put others first, to be generous, to give until it hurts. But here's the truth. If you don't respect yourself enough to set boundaries, you're not truly giving from a place of abundance. You're giving from a place of depletion. And that's where Stoicism offers a profound perspective. Self-respect isn't just a nice to have. It's the foundation of living virtuously. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." At its core, this is a call to honor your own nature, to live in alignment with your values and principles. And part of that alignment means respecting yourself enough to say no when something doesn't serve you. Think about it. If you're constantly overcommitting, saying yes to every request and stretching yourself thin, are you really living virtuously, or are you sacrificing your well-being for the sake of others' approval? Here's a scenario you might relate to. You're already juggling a packed schedule: work, family, personal projects, and then a friend asks you to help them move this weekend. You want to say no, but you feel guilty. You think, if I don't help, they'll think I'm a bad friend. But here's the Stoic question: is saying yes truly virtuous, or are you just avoiding discomfort? Respecting yourself means recognizing your limits and honoring them. It means understanding that you can't pour from an empty cup. So let's ask the hard question: do you prioritize others' needs over your own well-being? If the answer is yes, it's time to reframe how you see boundaries. They're not walls to keep people out. They're acts of self-respect that allow you to show up as your best self. When you set a boundary, you're not rejecting others, you're affirming your own worth. You're saying, I matter enough to protect my time, energy, and peace. And here's the beautiful thing: when you respect yourself, you inspire others to respect you too. It's not about being harsh or unkind. It's about being clear and consistent. It's about living in alignment with your values, even when it's uncomfortable. Because at the end of the day, self-respect isn't just a gift to yourself, it's a gift to everyone around you. When you're grounded, centered, and at peace, you're able to give more authentically and meaningfully. So, the next time you're tempted to say yes when you really want to say no, pause and ask yourself, am I honoring my own nature? Am I respecting myself enough to set this boundary? Because in the end, self-respect isn't selfish, it's essential. And it's the first step toward living a life of virtue, balance, and true fulfillment. Why does setting boundaries feel so uncomfortable? It's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Think about the last time you had to say no to someone. Maybe it was a friend, a family member, or a colleague. Did you feel that knot in your stomach, that hesitation, that fear of how they might react? If so, you're not alone. Discomfort is a natural part of setting boundaries, but here's the Stoic twist. That discomfort isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign of growth. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who endured slavery and hardship, once said, "No great thing is created suddenly, any more than a bunch of grapes or a fig." If you tell me that you desire a fig, I answer you that there must be time. Let it first blossom, then bear fruit, then ripen. In other words, growth takes time, effort, and yes, discomfort. Setting boundaries is no different. It's a practice, a skill that requires us to lean into the unease, to endure the temporary discomfort for the sake of something greater, living in alignment with our values. Let's bring this into a real-life scenario. Imagine you need to have a difficult conversation with a loved one. Maybe it's about needing more space or setting limits on how much you can help them. The thought of that conversation might make your heart race. You might worry about hurting their feelings or damaging the relationship. But here's the thing, avoiding that discomfort doesn't make the situation better. In fact, it often makes it worse. By not setting the boundary, you're sacrificing your own well-being, and over time, that can lead to resentment, burnout, or even a breakdown in the relationship. So ask yourself, what discomfort are you avoiding by not setting boundaries? Is it the fear of conflict, the worry of being judged, the uncertainty of how someone will react? Whatever it is, the Stoics would tell you this: that discomfort is not your enemy, it's your teacher. It's showing you where you need to grow, where you need to stand firm, and where you need to honor yourself. Think of it like building a muscle. When you first start lifting weights, it's uncomfortable. Your muscles ache, your body protests, but over time, that discomfort leads to strength. The same is true for setting boundaries. The more you practice, the more you lean into the discomfort, the stronger and more confident you become. And eventually, what once felt impossible becomes second nature. So, the next time you feel that familiar unease when setting a boundary, don't run from it, lean into it. Remind yourself that discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong, it's a sign that you're doing something right. You're growing, you're evolving, and you're stepping into a life that's more aligned with who you truly are. And isn't that worth a little discomfort? Boundaries are meaningless without knowing what you stand for. Think about that for a moment. If you don't have a clear sense of your values, how can you know where to draw the line? How can you decide what to say yes to and what to say no to? This is where Stoicism offers a powerful framework: clarity of values. The Stoics believed that living a good life starts with understanding what truly matters to you. And when you align your boundaries with those values, something remarkable happens. The guilt begins to fade. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, put it this way: it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. In other words, life is too precious to spend on things that don't align with who we are. When we set boundaries based on our values, we're not just saying no to others, we're saying yes to a life of purpose and intention. We're choosing to live in a way that reflects what we truly care about. So, how do we get clear on our values? Here's a practical exercise to try. Take a moment to list your top 5 values. What matters most to you? Is it family, integrity, creativity, peace? Whatever it is, write it down. Now, take a look at your current boundaries. Are they aligned with those values? For example, if one of your core values is health, but you're constantly saying yes to late-night work calls that leave you exhausted, there's a disconnect. If you value family, but you're always putting others' needs ahead of quality time with your loved ones, something's out of balance. Here's the key: when your boundaries are rooted in your values, they don't feel like restrictions, they feel like affirmations. They're not about shutting people out, they're about honoring what's most important to you. And when you live this way, guilt loses its grip. Why? Because you're no longer acting out of fear or obligation. You're acting out of clarity and conviction. So let's pause and reflect. Are your boundaries aligned with your deepest values? If not, what's one small step you can take today to bring them into alignment? Maybe it's saying no to a commitment that drains you, or carving out time for something that truly matters to you. Remember, boundaries aren't just about protecting your time and energy. They're about living a life that's authentically yours. And when you align them with your values, you're not just setting limits, you're setting yourself free. Have you ever avoided setting a boundary because you were afraid of doing it wrong? Maybe you worried about saying the perfect thing, or you hesitated because you didn't want to hurt someone's feelings. It's a common struggle. We want to get it right, to handle every situation flawlessly. But here's the truth: perfection is an illusion, and the Stoics knew this better than anyone. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, once wrote, "You don't have to turn this into something. It doesn't have to upset you." What he's saying is this: life is messy, and so are we. Mistakes aren't failures, they're opportunities to learn and grow. When it comes to setting boundaries, the same principle applies. You don't have to do it perfectly, you just have to do it. Let's take a real-life example. Imagine you've been feeling overwhelmed at work and you decide to set a boundary with your boss. You plan the conversation carefully, rehearsing what you'll say, but when the moment comes, it doesn't go as smoothly as you hope. Maybe you stumble over your words or your boss pushes back and you end up agreeing to more than you intended. Does that mean you failed? Not at all. It means you took a step, a messy, imperfect step toward honoring your needs, and that's where growth happens. The Stoics believed that progress, not perfection, is the goal. Every time you set a boundary, even if it's not perfect, you're practicing courage and self-respect. You're learning what works and what doesn't, and you're building the confidence to do it better next time. Think about it. What would happen if you allowed yourself to be imperfect in setting boundaries? What if, instead of aiming for flawless execution, you focused on taking action and learning as you go? Here's the thing, imperfection isn't a flaw, it's a feature of being human. When you embrace that truth, you free yourself from the paralyzing fear of getting it wrong. You start to see every attempt, every stumble as part of the journey. And over time, those imperfect steps add up to something powerful, a life lived with intention, clarity, and self-respect. So, the next time you hesitate to set a boundary because you're afraid of doing it wrong, remember Marcus Aurelius's wisdom: progress, not perfection, is the goal. Take the step, even if it's messy, learn from the experience, and trust that each imperfect attempt is bringing you closer to the life you want to live. Because in the end, it's not about getting it right, it's about having the courage to try. Why does saying no feel so confrontational? It's a question that stops many of us in our tracks. We worry that setting a boundary will come across as harsh, or that speaking our truth will lead to conflict. But here's the Stoic perspective. Assertiveness isn't about confrontation, it's about courage. It's about having the strength to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable. And for the Stoics, courage isn't just a virtue, it's a way of living in alignment with truth and respect. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who endured immense hardship, once said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." What he's saying is this: speaking your truth might feel awkward or risky, but it's essential for growth. When you set a boundary, you're not being confrontational, you're being honest, you're respecting yourself enough to say, "This is what I need," and respecting others enough to communicate it clearly. So, how do we practice this kind of assertiveness in real life? One practical tool is using I statements. Instead of saying, "You're asking too much of me," try, "I feel overwhelmed when I take on too much and I need to set some limits." This small shift in language makes a big difference. It keeps the focus on your experience and needs, rather than placing blame or creating defensiveness. It's honest, respectful, and rooted in your values, exactly what Stoicism teaches us to strive for. Now let's pause and reflect. Where in your life do you need to practice assertiveness? Is it at work, where you're constantly saying yes to extra tasks? In a relationship where you're afraid to voice your needs? Or maybe it's with yourself, where you're pushing past your limits because you don't want to disappoint others. Whatever it is, remember this: assertiveness isn't about being aggressive or unkind. It's about having the courage to be honest with yourself and with others. Think about it. What would change if you approached boundaries not as confrontations but as acts of respect? What if, instead of fearing the discomfort of saying no, you saw it as an opportunity to live more authentically? The Stoics would tell you that this is the path to true freedom. The freedom to be yourself, to honor your needs, and to build relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. So, the next time you feel that hesitation to speak up, remember Epictetus's wisdom. Be willing to be thought foolish if it means staying true to yourself. Use I statements to communicate your boundaries with clarity and kindness, and trust that over time, this practice of assertiveness will not only transform your relationships, it will transform how you see yourself. Because in the end, courage isn't just about facing external challenges, it's about facing yourself and choosing to live with integrity. Guilt is often a sign of misplaced priorities. Think about that for a moment. When we feel guilty about setting boundaries, it's usually because we've convinced ourselves that someone else's needs or expectations should come before our own. But here's the thing, guilt isn't always a bad thing. It can be a signal, a nudge to reassess what truly matters. The Stoics understood this deeply, and they had a powerful tool for managing guilt: reason. Seneca, one of Stoicism's most profound thinkers, once said, "Reason is the greatest good, for it is the only thing that can distinguish between what is good and what is not." In other words, reason helps us cut through the noise of emotions and see things clearly. It allows us to ask, is this guilt justified, or is it rooted in irrational beliefs? Are we feeling guilty because we've truly done something wrong, or because we're afraid of disappointing someone? Let's break this down with an example. Imagine you've set a boundary with a friend. Maybe you've told them you can't lend them money this time. You feel guilty afterward, worrying that they'll think less of you or that you've let them down. But here's where reason comes in. Ask yourself, is this guilt healthy? Are you truly responsible for their financial situation, or are you taking on a burden that isn't yours to carry? Reason helps us see that guilt, in this case, might be a sign of misplaced priorities, prioritizing their approval over your own well-being. Now, let's take it a step further. What if, instead of letting guilt consume you, you reframed it as a signal to reassess your priorities and ask, what's truly important here? Is it maintaining your financial stability, or is it avoiding discomfort? When you approach guilt with reason, it becomes less of a burden and more of a teacher. It shows you where you might be out of alignment with your values, and it gives you the clarity to make better choices moving forward. So, here's a question to reflect on. What irrational beliefs fuel your guilt around boundaries? Is it the belief that saying no makes you selfish? That setting limits means you're unkind? The Stoics would tell you this. Those beliefs are not rooted in reason. They're rooted in fear of judgment, fear of conflict, fear of not being enough. But when you use reason to challenge those beliefs, you start to see them for what they are: illusions. Reason reminds us that boundaries are not about rejecting others. They're about honoring ourselves. They're about living in alignment with our values, even when it's uncomfortable. And when we do that, guilt loses its power. It becomes not a weight to carry, but a tool to guide us toward a life of clarity, purpose, and peace. So, the next time guilt creeps in after setting a boundary, pause. Use reason to ask, is this guilt justified, or is it a sign of misplaced priorities? And let that question lead you back to what truly matters. Why is it hardest to set boundaries with those we love? Think about it for a moment. With strangers or co-workers, saying no might feel uncomfortable, but it's often easier to detach. With family and friends, though, it's different. We care deeply about their feelings, and the fear of disappointing them or worse, damaging the relationship, can feel overwhelming. But here's the truth: setting boundaries with loved ones isn't about pushing them away. It's about creating healthier, more authentic connections, and this is where Stoicism offers a profound perspective. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, once wrote, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." At first glance, this might seem contradictory. How can we be kind to others while also holding firm to our own boundaries? But here's the Stoic wisdom: kindness doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. It means treating others with respect while staying true to your own values. In other words, you can love someone deeply and still say no when something doesn't align with your well-being. Let's bring this into a real-life scenario. Imagine you have a relative who's emotionally draining. Maybe they're constantly negative, or they rely on you for support to the point where it's affecting your own mental health. You want to help, but you also know you need to set limits. How do you navigate that? The Stoics would tell you this: relationships are opportunities for growth, not obligations. They're meant to enrich your life, not deplete it. So, setting a boundary here isn't about rejecting your relative, it's about creating space for both of you to thrive. Here's how you might approach it. Instead of avoiding them or snapping in frustration, you could say something like, "I care about you and want to support you, but I need to take care of my own well-being too." Let's find a way to connect that works for both of us. This isn't about shutting them out, it's about finding balance, and that balance is key to maintaining healthy, loving relationships. Now let's pause and reflect. How can you balance love and boundaries in your own relationships? Is there someone in your life who drains your energy, but you've been hesitant to set limits because you're afraid of hurting them? The Stoics would remind you that true love isn't about sacrificing yourself, it's about showing up authentically, with kindness and respect for both yourself and the other person. Think about it. What would change if you saw boundaries not as walls but as bridges? Bridges that allow you to connect more deeply because you're no longer carrying resentment or exhaustion. Bridges that create space for mutual respect and understanding. When you set boundaries with love, you're not just protecting your own well-being, you're creating the foundation for stronger, more meaningful relationships. So, the next time you feel that tug of guilt or fear when setting a boundary with a loved one, remember Marcus Aurelius's wisdom: be kind but stay true to yourself. Because in the end, boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about building connections that honor who you are and who they are too, and that's a gift worth giving. Why do we struggle to set boundaries at work? Think about it for a moment. Is it the fear of being seen as uncommitted, the pressure to prove ourselves? Or maybe it's the worry that saying no will cost us opportunities or respect. Whatever the reason, one thing is clear: setting boundaries at work can feel like walking a tightrope. But here's the good news: Stoicism offers a steady hand to guide us. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who endured slavery and hardship, once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." In other words, know your values and let them guide your actions, even in the workplace. For the Stoics, integrity isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about staying true to yourself, no matter the external pressures. And temperance, one of the 4 cardinal virtues, reminds us that balance is key. It's not about working harder, it's about working smarter in alignment with your principles. Let's bring this into a real-world scenario. Imagine you've been working late every night, sacrificing time with your family, your hobbies, even your sleep, all because you're afraid to say no to your boss. You're overextended, exhausted, and starting to resent your job. But here's the Stoic question: is this sustainable? Is this how you want to live? Integrity asks you to reflect. Are you honoring your values, or are you bending to external expectations? And temperance reminds you, enough is enough. So how do you start setting boundaries at work without feeling guilty? It begins with clarity. Define your limits, whether it's your work hours, your workload, or your availability outside of office hours, and communicate them with respect. For example, if your boss asks you to take on yet another project, you might say, "I'd love to help, but I need to prioritize my current commitments to maintain quality." Let's discuss how we can manage this. This isn't about being uncooperative, it's about being honest and professional. Now let's pause and reflect. How can you align your work boundaries with your values? Is it by protecting your evenings for family time, by saying no to tasks that don't align with your role or expertise, or by setting clear limits on how often you check your email after hours? Whatever it is, remember this: boundaries aren't about rejecting responsibility, they're about reclaiming your integrity. They're about showing up as your best self, not as a burnt-out version of yourself. The Stoics believed that true success isn't measured by how much you can endure, but by how well you live in alignment with your values. So, the next time you feel the pressure to overextend at work, remember Epictetus's wisdom. Know what you stand for and let that guide your actions, because in the end, setting boundaries isn't just about protecting your time, it's about protecting your integrity. And that's a boundary worth holding. Sometimes the strongest boundary is saying nothing at all. Think about that for a moment. In a world that constantly demands our attention, our energy, and our words, silence can be one of the most powerful tools we have. It's not about shutting down or shutting others out, it's about protecting our peace and clarity. The Stoics understood this deeply, and they practiced silence not as a retreat, but as a way of reclaiming their power. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, once wrote, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." In other words, silence gives us the space to pause, to reflect, and to respond with wisdom rather than react with emotion.